Thank you all for coming and sharing your time and your space with us this morning. I'm really excited to be here with Cailin this morning. She has, I mean, wait until I was literally telling her about her background this morning and how overwhelming it is. But the topic today can be very heavy. And so if you need to take a step back at any point in time, turn off your camera, vent, raise your hand and vent, like whatever it is, share, please do. This is a safe space. And at any point in time you want me to stop recording, just you can message me in the chat and I will do so. The topic is obviously really timely. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and as we know, the level of gender-based violence has increased. We're seeing the shadow pandemic against women. And I think as sisters standing in solidarity with each other, it's going to be really important that we listen and learn and realize what those kind of warning signs are so we can help each other or be able to connect those in need to the services that they require. And yeah, so this is just a safe sharing space. Let it be therapeutic for you all. If you want to share, it's completely up to you. No pressure to. So with that in mind, also, I know Cailin will probably bring this up, but you do have the 16 days campaign coming up, starting November 25th on the International Day on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. So the 16 days campaign is the Orange Your World UN Unite campaign. So on the 25th, a lot of people wear orange and do advocacy around that topic. So if you do want to share in, I can provide more information on that in the chat. It ends on December 10th on International Human Rights Day. So it's just a way to raise awareness. Yeah, thank you, Cailin. It's just a way to raise awareness about the issue and how prevalent it is in our societies. So please feel free to join in on that campaign. You can share photos with Zahara's stream. We're going to be doing our own advocacy during the 16 days. So please join in on that. So without further ado now, I will tell you all about Cailin. She has worked to improve policies for vulnerable populations and survivors of gender-based violence through service in multiple federal agencies, managing multi-million-dollar grant programs, leading interagency teams, and advising senior leaders in the White House and the Departments of Defense, Justice, and Health and Human Services. She's worked for both Vice President Biden's advisors on violence against women as a two-time detailee in the White House, shaping policies to reform military sexual assault, leading a Trilateral Working Group on violence against Indigenous women and girls with the National Security Council, and serving on the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault. In 2015 to 2016, she was recruited by the U.S. mission to the UN to serve as a U.S. government secondee to the UN Development Program, advising on the inclusion of older persons and persons with disabilities in the Sustainable Development Goals. She currently serves as a policy advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, leading a strategy to prevent intimate partner and sexual violence, child abuse, and neglect, impacting service members and their family. Outside of her federal service, she's a senior research consultant for Everytown for gun safety, guiding Everytown's research on the intersection of intimate partner and sexual violence with mass shootings and domestic terrorism. She's a Truman National Security Fellow and a Bloomberg American Health Initiative Fellow. So, like I said, she's done a lot of things. And so really, really excited that she's here to provide her wisdom and expertise. I actually met her in the broader gender-based violence world, and she's just really impressive and a very heartfelt and warm person. So I'm really glad that she's here with us this morning. So I turn it over to you now, Cailin.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that incredibly kind introduction, and I would echo the same thing back to you. So it's such a privilege to be with all of you today and speaking on this, as Jessica noted, really timely topic, not only with the backdrop of COVID that's permeated all aspects of our lives, and certainly heightened risk for survivors. But also, as Jessica notes, on the precipice of the 16 Days campaign to end violence against women and gender-based violence, which thematically this year is focused on supporting survivors in the world of work. So I'm going to give you an introduction to a lot of the progress that we've made collectively in advocacy efforts on that specific theme, and hopefully tie that back to information you can all keep in mind as far as what rights you have in the workplace, and how to really take care of yourself, take care of each other, regardless of your setting or access to resources. We can all be resilient. I have no doubt that you all are incredibly resilient, strong women, and excited to chat with you all today. So if we can pull up my slides, or maybe you already have, and I'm just not tech savvy enough on Zoom to see them. Okay, perfect. Excellent. So we're going to be talking today about recovery from sexual abuse and harassment. I'm going to focus our discussion a bit, a lot on the impact of gender-based violence, particularly sexual abuse and harassment, on our professional lives, but want to emphasize that especially during this increasingly digitized world of work that we're in with the pandemic. I think we all know that the lines between personal and professional, work and home life are very much blurred. And so it's really important that we're patient with ourselves and patient with colleagues, as we're all dealing with many different things. And one of those challenges that we may likely be dealing with, colleagues may be dealing with, or perhaps you've dealt with or are still really dealing with, is gender-based violence of some form. So next slide. So I want to share with you today a few key points. We're going to chat about sexual abuse and harassment, understanding its prevalence globally and regionally. I want to also touch on, in particular, stalking and online violence and abuse, since that has increasingly, and even before the pandemic, become a key dimension of gender-based violence that women and girls, and in particular, LGBTQ and gender nonconforming persons really experience. I want to also talk about the impacts of violence and abuse, as I noted, on our personal lives, and also how that impacts us in the workplace. I'm going to also chat about the human rights that we all have when it comes to the world of work, and the right to be free from violence, abuse, and harassment. I'm excited to share with you two really important, I think, resources to have in your back pocket. One is progress that we've made in the past couple of years as a global community of advocates with the International Labor Organization's Convention on Violence and Harassment. And I also want to make sure you're all aware of a resource that the World Bank publishes every year. It's called Women, Business, and the Law, and it's a really incredible index and really encyclopedia of legislation and laws related to women's rights across multiple domains, that is really good for you to have handy and know what are my rights per the law in my country. And of course, this is a difficult topic. Jessica couldn't have said it better when she was introducing today's session. This is a challenging set of conversations to have. I think as I go into some of the data, it'll be reflective of, if not your own experiences, certainly that of people you love and you're close with. Gender-based violence, sexual abuse, and harassment is very real. It's very prevalent. It impacts so many of us, and so know that you're not alone. Whether that means you're a survivor yourself, or you have friends and loved ones who you have seen struggle. Want to give you some resources to have at your fingertips on how to support them, how to support yourself, and take care of each other. So before I dive into deeply to the topics today, I wanted to get a sense from who we have in the virtual room with us. If you're comfortable putting in a message into the chat box, where you're coming from today. Would love to get a sense of the different parts of the world that we have in this discussion. Boston, awesome. Just a little bit north of me. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C. Italy, wonderful. Ethiopia, fabulous. Egypt, Uganda, incredible group of women. Nigeria, New York from India, wonderful. Kenya, New York, wonderful. Feel free to keep putting in notes in the chat, originally from Chad, fabulous. As well as, I should just note in terms of housekeeping, please note in the chat any questions, comments, or concerns just as we're going along. I want this to be interactive and conversational. So while I'm going to endeavor to get through all of the slides, so make sure to cover the topics and the range of topics within our broader discussion. I want to be sure to get to any questions and recognize comments and experiences that folks want to share. And we're going to make sure that we open it up to questions in the second half of this call. All right, so we can go to the next slide. Yes, Tanzania. Oh, California. I'm from California. I see you're now in Connecticut. Fabulous. Yes, so also, again, Jessica so perfectly said this at the outset. These topics are challenging. They can be really triggering. It's totally always okay to take a break from the screen, get up, grab a glass of water, tune out, go to another room if possible, or even log out and log back in to give yourself some space to breathe. Your needs are what should come first. All right, next slide. So this is an infographic from the World Health Organization that I love because it's really illustrative of the global scope and impact of sexual violence by non-partners, as well as intimate partner violence, including physical and sexual abuse, but also emotional, psychological abuse, and inclusive of psychological abuse that includes financial and economic abuse. So there's a wide range of manifestations of gendered violence and abuse, and their rates vary, of course, by region, but broadly speaking, World Health Organization notes that it's 1 in 3 women globally have experienced some form of intimate partner violence or sexual violence by someone other than a partner. I'll note that the overwhelming majority of sexual violence, which includes harassment and assault by Non-partners are people who are still known to the survivor. So it's an acquaintance, it's a coworker, a boss, um, a fellow student, a family member. So the majority of the experiences that women have with violence and abuse are endemic to many of the relationships that they have with people they already know. You can take a look at the region that you're currently in or come from to get a more specific sense of rates. We can see, so in North America and collectively the Americas, so North and South America, it's just under 1 in 3 women. And of course, we have in Southeast Asia the highest recorded rates of more than 1 in 3 women. I want to note, and this is something that World Health Organization is really careful to state as well. While this is a powerfully large number of women globally who have experienced abuse and violence and has been tracked by WHO surveys, this is still very much an undercount. I think we can all understand, and I'm sure we have experts in the room working in these areas as well, that this is by nature a really difficult topic. It touches on social and cultural norms that can impact reporting. And of course, in many cases, and particularly during COVID, it's not safe. It doesn't feel safe. In many cases, isn't for survivors to report and self-identify. And in fact, UNICEF and the World Health Organization have put out of late some really important guidance for researchers on how to follow principles of do no harm to safely and ethically collect data on rates of gender-based violence, including child sexual abuse during the COVID-19 pandemic, because there are just so many dimensions of risk that have been exacerbated or newly introduced during the pandemic. So all that to say, 1 in 3 women is incredibly high. Unfortunately, it's likely much higher than that, depending on the region and context. And of course, in areas of heightened conflict, in refugee settings, the rates are even higher. International Rescue Committee just put out an important report on increasing rates of intimate partner violence reported by women in refugee camps, and it's 3/4 of women have noted reporting some form of violence from an intimate partner since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's higher than what we're currently tracking. And so just be kind to each other, be kind to yourselves. Okay, next slide. So what that World Health Organization estimate did not specifically include in their survey and ask women about is online harassment, cyber stalking, cyber harassment. So I wanted to be sure to include that in our chat today, since that's a reality. It's really a key feature and not a bug of gender-based violence in the 21st century. Whether that is online abuse, the form of trolling, hateful messages, and direct messages by people you may know or may not know, networked abuse, where different online groups through communities that are developed through sites like Reddit or 8chan gather together. They're typically aggrieved young men. You may have heard of the term incel, which stands for involuntarily celibate. It's a group of self-identified young men, overwhelmingly white males in North America, who feel very aggrieved by the gender norms that perversely they find to be women are too equal, women are too empowered, and they're saying no to any sexual advances that men like them seek to promote and exercise. And so they feel very socially marginalized. Again, very interesting dynamic there, given everything we know about systemic racism and sexism globally, and in particular, again, in the North American context. So the aggrievedness of these young white males is something that researchers are increasingly looking at. But really, in the context of online gender-based violence, it's important to note that there are active communities of men who troll and organize their trolling. And I like this definition that the International Center for Research on Women put out in a really great report that I'll share with all of you following up this conversation, on developing a framework to address technology-facilitated gender-based violence. They include this definition here, which I encourage you to take a moment to read. It's pretty broad, but that's because I think, as we're all really too keenly aware, technology permeates every aspect of our lives these days. And so where there is technology, there is the ability for that technology to be misused, most often by intimate partners, but in particular for women in public facing roles and public life. Additionally, that attracts, cyberbullying, cyber harassment, and cyber stalking, which is highly prevalent. UN Women and the UN Broadband Commission a few years ago put out a groundbreaking global survey on online abuse and stalking and harassment. Roughly 3 in every 4 women and girls globally have experienced some form of this abuse. And it's important to note and really not minimize that even abuse that originates or takes place majority online has real world impacts on survivors' mental health, on their physical safety. This can lead to online stalking as well as stalking in person, particularly in the context of intimate partner abuse. And it can destroy women's livelihoods. So, the distribution of non-consensual digital images, more commonly known as revenge porn, abusers can use private photos that they've either received previously in good faith from a former or current partner as blackmail, or folks who may have some vulnerabilities in their personal cybersecurity, who may have been hacked, or their colleagues have been privy to some sort of personal photo sensitive information, again, that may have been shared in good faith or shared to someone other than the abuser or blackmailer. It's a real challenge today for women, and increasingly girls, adolescent girls. In North America, suicide rates among adolescent girls between 11 and 14, so quite young adolescent girls, have skyrocketed over in the hundreds of percentages, an increase in suicide rates in the past 5 years. I think we can all agree what's happened in the past 5 years that's really influenced our social lives and contexts and social media. You know, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. Although that's not cool for younger girls and teens. You know, it's very real. Snapchat, yep, it's all very much impacting our mental health and welfare. And so just know, I think you all do know this, but it's really important to make visible and recognize the struggles that survivors have. There's a completely false binary between online abuse and physical or in-person abuse, mental health, well-being. Next slide. And I should also just note, while the data that I'm presenting today is specifically talking about women and girls, cisgender women and girls, that's not for a lack of experiences with abuse and harassment that LGBTQ persons, gender non-conforming persons, and also men and boys experience with gender-based violence. There's just a lot less data on those communities, particularly in contexts where self-identifying as LGBTQ plus is unsafe, where the law doesn't recognize equal rights and dignity and existence, which we've seen in many years, including in my own country, increasingly under threat, these communities, despite some modest gains in recent years. So I want to just make sure that I'm acknowledging our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters and gender non-conforming friends. So in terms of the impacts of violence, abuse, and harassment, I alluded to some of them. This is another good infographic from World Health Organization that really illuminates how gender-based violence impacts our health, both as an immediate consequence of the abuse, injury, and in the worst case scenarios, death, intimate partner homicide. There's also a huge impact on our mental health, of course, and then our physical health that is a result of coping behaviors that survivors engage in as a means of therapeutic support in the moment. So things like alcohol consumption increasing to the point of becoming alcohol misuse, substance misuse, even smoking cigarettes to a very high degree of consumption, which we know has deleterious impacts on our physical health, immediate and long term. These are all health consequences of violence, abuse, and harassment. And in particular, sexual harassment in the workplace has been linked to, as has intimate partner violence, PTSD, so acute and prolonged traumatic responses, depression, and self-doubt. And I want to talk a little bit about the first and third points that I mentioned, PTSD and then self-doubt. So PTSD, we often associate this probably most commonly with the military, with people who serve in uniform. And while that's certainly apt, increasingly it is so important that the field of research and health practitioners working with and supporting survivors of gender-based violence recognize that traumatic stress is a very real dimension of living with abuse. Survivors are resilient. human beings are resilient. The human condition is resilient. Um, but part of the experience of living in prolonged abusive relationships, or in a workplace where you're constantly walking on eggshells and unsure for your safety, whether that's physical safety or emotional safety, that triggers a stress response in your brain. And there's been a lot of important scholarship in the past decade on the neurobiology of trauma. And we really know that stress hormones are at a heightened level for survivors of gender-based violence. And once they become heightened, it's very difficult for the threat response in our brains to shut down. And that impacts our mental health. But increasingly, we're learning that chronic trauma and chronic stress related to trauma also has some long-term physical health implications. And then the third point on self-doubt, that's important because I think that relates to, well, I know in my experience working with survivors and in my personal experience, that self-doubt is sort of, there are two sides to that coin when it comes to violence and abuse, and particularly in the workplace. One side of it is that as a survivor, you feel gaslit. That's a term, if you're not familiar with, was actually coined by a feminist activist in the UK quite some time ago, literally in the last century, towards the end of it. And it refers to someone in an abusive role, whether that's a partner, colleague, family member, denying events that in many instances that person has contributed to harm you or to harm another person. Abusive comments, abusive psychological and emotional abuse, and denying and minimizing their own actions and responsibilities, or that of others they may be defending, so that the person who's been the target of abuse is left questioning whether their experience, whether their truth and reality ever actually happened. And so the side of the self-doubt coin related to gaslighting is, was this my fault? Did I somehow imply that I was interested in him or her? Did I somehow imply that I would tolerate this type of behavior? Did I do something to upset him or her? So doubting your own integrity and dignity, and suggesting that that may be cause for the abuse or harms that you've experienced. And then the other side of the self-doubt coin is, once you're living with that reality as a survivor, and you may very likely be continuing to live with your abusive partner or work with the person who was abusive, it really can erode your confidence and impact your daily well-being, and to the point that you're unsure if, should I keep this job? Should I stay in school because there's so many of these problems and stressors that, I'm too busy to be present with my partner, or, I know I'm great at this job. I love my work. But after that experience, I don't know how I could possibly go back there. Those are all very valid questions and experiences. So I'm not minimizing those thoughts as they may have occurred to you or other survivors. But they're problematic in that the person who is responsible for the harm is likely not having those questions. And so too often we see that women, remove themselves from jobs that they love or school programs that, a university program that's pivotal to their aspirations, or stay in a relationship that is unhealthy for them and maybe their children, because there are other barriers, often financial, but also emotional, and particularly when it comes to intimate partner violence. Most survivors don't necessarily want to immediately leave the relationship or stop contact with the person who's harming them. They love that person oftentimes. They just want the abuse to stop. And so self-doubt can also really come in, questioning, what is the right path here for me? So a lot of complexity surrounding this. And it's important, when we talk about GBV in the workplace, since I've been discussing intimate partner violence a lot, those certainly have spillover. That form of abuse certainly has spillover effects into the workplace. Next slide. And I saw some great comments as well. Yes, Setsu, self-doubt is damaging because it hinders help seeking, and it becomes about what you've done wrong instead of what has been done to you. Perfectly said. That's absolutely right. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these next couple of slides. They're more just for you to keep and consider, because I think it's so important that the global community has really drawn a line in the sand, as of only 2 years ago, in establishing the first ever convention on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work. It is going to be entering into full force in June of this next year. What that means will be that it is a part of international human rights law, which we hope will have the impact of norm setting, influencing legislation in other countries that don't have workplace protections for survivors, as well as strengthening implementation and enforcement of laws in countries that do have that. And importantly, it addresses not only laws and frameworks that need to be protective to prevent harassment and abuse, but it also establishes a common framework for remedies and support for workers who do experience harassment. Next slide. And I mentioned this a little earlier in our call, but I want to just emphasize this is a good tool, particularly to look comparatively across the world. This World Bank Index tracks 190 different economies, 190 different countries. And in addition to checking on these two key questions related to gender equality in the workplace, there are also a number of questions related to women's equality in the law, related to property rights and inheritances, retirement security and pensions, domestic violence, whether or not, for example, sexual violence in marriage is recognized as such, all really important markers of gender equity. And so I encourage you to look up where your country stands in this index, because it's a powerful tool to be able to know where you are, where your country is compared to others, and use it as an advocacy tool. Next slide. So I wanted to just note some resources for survivors. Most countries, not all, have some sort of national domestic violence hotline or crisis line. I'm looking forward to following up with you all and putting in the specific crisis line information for your country. And we'll do that in an email that Jessica will help facilitate, and also make sure all these slides get to you. But also I want to talk briefly about safety planning. Safety planning is something that anyone can do anywhere to help lower your risk of abuse by your partner or another abuser. I want to emphasize this is not to say that survivors have any role in abuse that they've experienced. It's anticipating based on prior abuse, and knowing your environment, whether that's your workplace or your home environment, your school environment, being able to anticipate based on previous experiences what abuse might next look like, and activating your network of support, of friends, of trusted family, trusted colleagues, to be able to have resources to access in anticipation of abuse that, depending on the nature of the abuse, may likely happen again, to minimize the harm that you experience. Importantly, we define safety planning as survivor-led and strengths-based. And what that comes down to is each survivor knows their experience better than any victim advocate can tell them. They know the nature of what they're experiencing, and they know what they want, whether that is access to justice in the form of some legal remedy, or that's just taking care of their emotional and mental health while they're determining next steps. I want to just acknowledge in the chat. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, Okech. And I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. Personally, my name is often mispronounced, so I'm very sympathetic to that. I appreciate you sharing that. I'm so sorry that you've experienced that. Disbelief is a huge challenge. So I hope that this conversation, at the very least, feels a bit validating, that you're not alone, even though certainly had felt that way enduring that experience. For those of us who are in the US, UK, Ireland, and Canada, absolutely, thank you for bravely sharing your truth. There's a great new resource that's come out actually during the COVID-19 pandemic, called the Crisis Text Line. And it is intended to be a sort of one-stop place for help for someone who is experiencing a crisis of any kind, whether that's struggling with mental health, suicidal ideation, related to any number of mental health concerns. We all have them, particularly during this challenging time, but also sexual violence and intimate partner violence. This text line can connect you immediately with an advocate or a emotional support resource specific to the challenge that you're experiencing. And for folks who are not in those 4 countries, they do have a capability to chat over Facebook Messenger. So I would encourage you all to check that out. I'll follow up to make sure you have the link. And then I wanted to flag, there is a risk assessment and safety planning tool that was developed by Jessica, actually, and her colleagues at the National Democratic Institute a couple of years ago. It's to support women who are in politics or some sort of public-facing role, journalists, activists, civil servants, civil society, who experience increased levels of public exposure that have created additional harassment and abuse, whether that's trolling and cyberbullying from haters that are not unknown to you, or whether your role has also triggered threatening behaviors from a partner or from someone you know, because, yes, well done, Jessica, because your work may be disruptive of traditional gender norms in your country or culture, and being seen as a woman and a leader is penalized. Because of the sensitivity of the resource and the supports that it provides, I didn't want to put in the link directly here, but we will email it to all of you who are interested. Last slide. So I want to reserve this 10 minutes for open questions and dialogue. So I'll just leave this here while we have a chat. Yeah. This is a great infographic from the National Network to End Domestic Violence on how to help a friend who may be experiencing domestic abuse during COVID. But honestly, these are evergreen tips and best practices for any time, any place, anywhere. The most important piece is, I think, the third from the left: be supportive and believe in them. And the rest will come from there. Thank you all so much. Looking forward to any discussion or questions you all may have. So Jessica, please feel free to open it up.
All right, yeah. Thank you so much, Cailin, for giving us all the tips and resources and information that we can all use in our daily lives. There's kind of three takeaways really, like that I've from what I've been hearing and things that you've said. One, just reiterating on the safety planning tool for everybody. These are very individualized plans. So what the plan for me versus someone who has children versus someone who has a disability is going to look very, very different. And as Cailin said, you are your best informant. So when advocates work with each individual woman on this, they work really with their expertise. When you're in a home with an abuser, for example, you tend to know what the abuser's actions, you can anticipate what it may look like. So it's important to know that you are your best form of expertise in that way. And yes, on the safety planning tool for politically active women, that's actually how I met Cailin. So we will send the link for that. It's in many forms. You can do it paper, an app, online. And we developed that with politically active women from all over the world. So for those who are active in the public space, that can be helpful to you. But the other two things that really resonated with me, and I'm going to do this instead of I usually ask questions, but this is really more, like I said, for a therapeutic space. And thank you so much for those who have been sharing their truths and experiences in the chat. Self-blaming is real. Okay. I mean, we all, for everyone who has experienced some form of violence in their life, which at least 1 in 3 of us here have in some form or shape or way, we always ask ourselves those questions of, why did I go to that party instead of, why did he do or she do the things that happened to me? Mm-hmm. Or why didn't I tell a parent about what that family member did instead of, a lot of times you're young, you're a child, you wouldn't know these things, you wouldn't know any better. So all these types of self-blaming questions, we all do it to each other, and it's not healthy, and it's not the way that it should be. So just know that those aren't the right questions to be asking yourself, and going through that with a counselor or a friend, which I'm sure all of us here would be willing to lend an ear as well. Kinds of helps you walk through that. And that the third thing you raised, should I stay in this job? That is real. That is very real. I know probably some of us have experienced some form of violence in our jobs, whether that be harassment or some type of emotional abuse perpetuated. I mean, a lot of times we say by men, but sometimes by women. And it's a cycle. And it's recognizing that cycle. It's saying that I'm not going to be a part of replicating that cycle, as I've seen what it's been done to me. Don't let it, take you away from the field. When Cailin was saying, people remove themselves from the jobs and the spaces that they love, and they don't reach the aspirations that they have. Who wins in that? We're not benefiting from ourselves and being able to reach our dreams. And so in any possible way, that's what Zahara Stream is here for. If you want to be in that space, if you want to be your own change maker in that way, like, we're here to completely support you in that way. So if any in time that we can be supportive to you all in that way, just please let us know. So on that three notes that I had, want to open it up to the floor for any other sharing, any questions. I'll just let folks kind of chime in as they want, or keep putting it in the chat.
I want to give the mic to Joanna because she noted that she'd like to raise a point. Floor is yours, Joanna. Thank you for engaging.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your talk, and I'm a big fan of taking screenshots during the presentation so I can loop back. But I thank you both, and Jessica, you're amazing. I appreciate your guidance in all our talks. But I mentioned before in the chat that I've actually experienced every single form of that you listed, from intimate partner violence, date rape, being set up by people to almost be raped, but I managed to escape. I've been followed home very dramatically. I've been harassed at work. But and even actually last week I was followed home. I live in a very small town in Connecticut, and I was followed home as I was running gleefully up the block, and I happened to notice the person, and I had to. I didn't go home because I saw what was happening. I went up the street and hid in the shadows, and then made some moves to double back. I asked a neighbor if I could cut through her yard. And so all of this, however wise I am, any of these things could still happen every day. And I told my housemates about it. This is my first mace I've ever owned. But like, I just went for an errand. I just went, down to the beach to go for a walk. And, I'm not really thrilled about carrying mace with me everywhere I go. I don't have a car. And so sometimes I'm biking or walking along the side of the road, here during the virus, our activities are restricted, but, even though, I have learned how to navigate the world of men in abusive, situations. Like that just happened last week. And so, the risk doesn't go away. I don't have a partner who's abusing me or the things in my safe place of my home, but that guy definitely was following me. Anyway, but what I was gonna say is that in last year I had a job where my boss was actually emotionally abusing me and the rest of every single person who worked in the place. And I couldn't leave right away. I eventually left the job, but he continued to harass me. He threatened to blackmail me. He told me people at the UN don't love me. I mean, ridiculous stuff. He actually is a man much like Trump, but with less money. Even grew up in Queens, and so what was I going to say? That continued on for a long time, and I told friends about it because I did feel I was in danger. I tried to file a police report, but the police in that town know the guy, and so that could have backfired. I tried to file a police report from New York because I didn't want to go to the place, to the region where that man was. And I was not able, I was blocked by the police because of state restrictions. I could not file a police report from the safe place where I was about the other place. And so, because of that, I didn't file a police report. And I also was fearing that if I did file a police report, that this crazy guy would do something even more mafioso-esque, and so that stood as it was. I all I could do was let my friends and family know, and I took screenshots and emailed myself and my sister every piece of evidence, just in case something should happen. I could say, look, here's all my evidence. Yes, he did really try to kill me, and blah blah blah. So that's one thing. I mean, I don't know, I'm not really looking for too much advice about that, but what I was going to say is that I already had experience with all these different things, and so I do reach out to my friends. I mean, every woman I know has a full understanding of what it feels like to be in danger or groped or molested or whatever. But I did try to talk with friends who are men about it, and some of them were very comforting. Some of them are experts in security, and like one of them, I asked for advice. I didn't say, can you intervene? I just asked for advice, and he did nothing. Several other friends who sit in all the meetings at the UN and know about every example of gender-based violence, they didn't believe me. They did not believe me, and it became arguments. Yes, I was really threatened. Yes, the guy is really a bastard. And and then it became partly my experiences, and these are the same men actually who still who didn't believe all these women who came forward saying Trump had aggressed them. There's more than 26 women who came forward to say that Trump either raped or assaulted them or groped them or whatever, and then they come forward, then they say oh, they just came forward for money. Who's getting money from coming forward to share their story? And I mean, most of my friends are not doubting me, but there is a certain percentage of men in the world who don't believe the women or think it's just some kind of like ploy to get attention. I don't need this kind of attention. No, thank you. No, thank you very much. And so these are people who love me and care for me, and but they, even then, like with all my pieces of evidence, they were still like, ha ha ha, this you're just making a big deal of it. And I can even I feel like I remember the feeling when I was having these discussions with these friends who care for me, that like if these people who know me very well don't believe me, how do we get to the point where other men are willing to step up? Not like the politicians who are tasked with the policy change or whatever, but the rest of them, how, I don't know. I mean, am I expecting an answer? But like, I just find that even though I experienced it, I find it hard to believe that the first step they make is like sticking up for the men. They don't know the men, but they probably don't want the men to seem so nefarious. But it's like, but these are the examples. These are my 20 examples of this, and I don't know. I wonder, even in the US, we don't have the CEDAW, we don't have the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Mm-hmm. These are agreed upon by many countries in the world, but we're far from, if these distinguished people in my life, the ones who didn't believe me are diplomats. They have access to all the information. They've been all around the world. If they don't believe me, like, how do we get from that perspective to, yes, we acknowledge you, and we have to make these changes.
Yeah. Well, Joanna, first, thank you so much for sharing that. That was really powerful. And I just want to, acknowledge what you've experienced. Very much real. I believe you. I believe you 1000%. I think it's important for us to all say that to each other. I'll also say that, and you know this, but it bears repeating, you're also more than your experiences with abuse and harassment and violence. Those don't define you.
Right.
However, those experiences do make you a really powerful advocate and an ally to others who have been through or are going through what you've experienced. The questions that you raised about disbelief and really victim blaming as well, for all forms of gendered violence and abuse, they're incredibly complex. Sometimes the answer is simple. Studies have shown that there is an inclination to minimize abuse. If one has experienced abuse and hasn't felt that they have had the ability or given themselves perhaps the emotional permission to acknowledge what they've experienced, that's very common for men and male survivors. Although I will say statistically, male survivors are much less common than women and LGBT. But the other is that it may be descriptive of behaviors that they have themselves engaged in some way, shape, or form on some continuum of gendered abuse and sexism. And so folks might feel called out and they might feel uncomfortable. A huge part of this is also the sort of the opposite of what we think of as bystander engagement. There's also related to norms of masculinity, men as protectors and defenders of the weak, and women being associated with that weakness and that needing of protection. We're increasingly learning that some of men's disbelief and comfort in acknowledging gender-based violence happening to people that they care about, their friends or loved ones, ignites in them some sort of sense of failure to protect. And whether that's directly related to an experience where they observed something they know is wrong, a sexist comment, sexual assaults, like groping in the workplace, that they didn't have the courage or feel like they had the social permission or capital to confront what their colleague or maybe their superior did in that moment. And so shame is very much related to choosing not to believe survivors, particularly those that they have friendships with. I don't need to tell you this, but and this is, of course, a very personal and independent choice. But I think you certainly learned a lot more about those people in your lives, and maybe the choices that you might make subsequently in terms of how comfortable you are letting them in, and having the privilege and the gift of your friendship based on their responses to what happened to you. Yes, I do. We need a healthy redefinition of masculinity. So much of the work we've done to date on gender-based violence is importantly and justifiably addressing immediate needs that survivors have for safety, whether that's a healthcare response, emergency housing and shelter, reproductive healthcare needs. And we're still fighting in every country for breadcrumbs of national budgets, of multilateral financial contributions to basic rights for survivors of GBV. And so if you think about, on top of that, the real need to understand how to best engage men and boys, and from a really young age, on the future that we all collectively want and know is healthier for everybody. You know, gender equity is very much not a zero-sum game. There's been really important gains in their research over the past several years. Groups I encourage you to check out if you're not familiar, like Promundo. And the Global Men Care Alliance. They're doing really transformational work on underscoring yes, exactly, Jessica. Really underscoring the ways that men and boys are also harmed, not in the same ways or the same degree as women and girls and gender nonconforming persons, but in very real ways as well. When anger is the only emotion that is culturally or socially acceptable for men, that's incredibly limiting. And that's painful at very deep levels. And that in turn perpetuates the use of violence and abuse and a default response of aggression to conflict or tension or frustration or loss for men and boys. So I think the more that we can do to just promote healing for everybody, while of course remembering it's important to center women and girls, particularly women and girls of color, depending on the country or context, is so critical.
In that case, though, I mean, for men to participate in that, they have to see that it's needed, and so
yeah,
you know, how to encourage them to make that first step. You know, I'm from California. I used to work at a kids camp, and the camp was in 80 acres in the woods, and they would rent out the space sometimes to different groups. One of the groups that would host maybe like a twice a year event, it was like I can't remember the name of it, but it was some kind of like, you know, how to be a better man, basically, how to be a better man, and how to, you know, how to be a man with this range of emotions. But somebody had to get to that point where they wanted to show up there and to sign up and to look for something like
feeling
that.
Comfortable, you know? Sending their sons.
Right. Well, it was for grown-ups. It was the camp.
Okay.
It was for adult men. It was for adult men who were ready to you know, to explore their, you know, their emotions.
If any of you all have not seen The Feminist in Cell Block Y, I highly encourage you to look that up. It's on YouTube. It's very powerful. It's about a man who was or is incarcerated, and in California, actually, and through his experience in prison, which I'm not at all advocating as therapeutic or healing or restorative or that the carceral system is a good model for GBV across the board. Just want to emphasize that. But it's the story of how that experience really taught him how harmful traditional masculinity is, and how he's rethinking that and created this very powerful peer circle of other men in prison to explore these questions. It gives me a lot of hope. And so I encourage you all to check that out.
I realize the time, but Cailin has graciously offered to stay on a little longer if anybody else would like to share.
And I'll also pop, my email in the chat here. If any of you all have questions or thoughts or comments beyond today's chat, please feel free to reach out. Well, hearing none at the moment, feel free to interrupt if there is another thought or comment or question. Want to just put in another plug for what Jessica and I shared at the outset of the call. Next week, Wednesday, 25 November, is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And that then marks 16 days through December 10th, which is International Human Rights Day. And if you follow the link I popped in at the beginning of the chat, which we can do again here, I encourage you to follow on social media, as well as sign up for the newsletter to get information on the great resources, stories of survivors, and policy updates on what we can all do together as a global network to improve the world for survivors. And this year's theme, particularly looking at workers in the informal sector and the backdrop of the shadow pandemic that Jessica mentioned of COVID really driving increased rates of gender-based violence. Good moment for us to really uplift each other's voices and experiences, and remind the world that survivors we're everywhere. We also vote. We also lead workplaces. We also are parents and friends, and really have stories to share that can be healing. Joanna, yes. I don't know that, are you, I think you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm interested in the, I guess, the sagas of the women who have stood up against the powerful men. Like in the case of Harvey Weinstein, I happen to have met years ago one of the first people who raised a case against him.
Wow.
And she we keep in touch, but she was brutalized by the world for having made this effort to take him down. Also the woman who has the case right now, E. Jean Carroll, the longtime columnist from Elle magazine, she's a very strong woman, and I hope that that she's safe, that no one comes to try to get her. But like that's a huge effort and contribution, and in her case, Elle magazine fired her after 30 years of writing this column. I used to read it when I was a child, and she is a distinguished person. I'm sure that she has a future ahead of her, but like I'm just, I don't know, I don't really have a question, but I'm interested in you know, what's at stake for people when they do come forward against someone who is, you know, obviously much more powerful than them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very real. Very real. And unfortunately, we don't know all too well, and you know, that we still live in a world where survivors are paying the price too often. But there's hope. You know, I think the Me Too movement that Tarana Burke started and has really reverberated globally has helped to slowly shift the scales of justice. In case you're not aware, I wanted to share with you a really exciting new phase of Tarana Burke's Me Too movement that just started, I think, last month. It's called Act Two, and it's an app that is really powering an organic social movement to provide survivors and allies and advocates with actionable tips on confronting sexual violence. So definitely check that out and explore it as well. You know, I think the more that we can have talking circles like this, connecting with each other, validating each other, you know, that's powerful. And I think to get to the world that we're all wanting to realize, the more connected that we are, the better. So Jessica, thank you so much for this lovely invitation to connect with all of you incredible women. I'm looking forward to being on the other side of the Zoom call for future Zahara's Dream talks. So hopefully we can stay in touch and engaged. I think I put my email in the chat box, but I will also make sure that Jessica shares it to all of you who tuned in. And I will follow up as well with some of the resources that I noted so that they're all in one spot for your reference. Thank you.
Thank you, Cailin, for everybody who shared their stories, their hearts, this conversation. It's such a warming feeling to be able to connect with you all on such a deep and emotional level. And when we're talking about, you know, perpetrators, I know Cailin and I have worked with many, and they go through, and like Cailin mentioned it earlier, like some of them have been abused themselves, and working through that, and it's not an excuse, but at the end of the day, a lot of this violence comes down to power, this power imbalance, and people wanting to take the power that you have, that they see. A lot of times that's why women, particular women, are targeted in a way. They see this glow that you have. They see that you may be a welcoming and warm person, and they want that for themselves. So it's really about either not letting them take that power in the first place, or if you feel that they have, taking that power back. And that's part of the Me Too movement, in standing in solidarity with each other to take that power back.
Yes.
So I'll leave you with this, to say that I hear you, I see you, and I am with you.
And I believe you.
And I believe you. Yep. So thank you all again for joining us this morning, and have a very happy weekend. And as always, reach out if you want to talk more.
Thank you, Jessica.